the dawn of the pirates. The days when there were only 3 radio stations to listen to in the UK, the Home Service, the Light programme, the 3rd programme in the evenings, and if you were lucky and the wind was blowing in the right direction, 208, the wonderful Radio Luxembourg. But on Easter Sunday 1964, Ronan O'Reilly broke that monopoly with the launch of Radio Caroline. And to guide you through the 60s, your moderator is former Caroline DJ, Ray Clark.
Thank you, Tony. My goodness, what a load of talent. Who goes on breakfast? That would be a battle to watch, wouldn't it? Who are we going to put on breakfast? I'm honoured. I'm sure everybody else is here at the attendance of these guys. And yes, you will get the recognition that you so richly deserved throughout this chat and at the end of it as well. I've been trying to work out chronologically who we should go to, first of all. Alan Turner, possibly if we're saying Caroline, but I think that's got to go to Bryan Vaughan and the Radio Atlanta story. Now, we're not going to squeeze that into 5 minutes, Bryan, but tell us the first that you knew about shipborne radio when you were in the UK and Radio Atlanta.
The way I came about it was I came from Sydney and I worked on 2CH and 2GB, which are big stations still to this day. And one of the guys who was my boss in Sydney was a guy called Ken Evans. And he was he'd come to England a few months before me, and I met him just by sheer chance somewhere in London. And he said, "Oh, there's a radio station starting on a boat, you know, off wherever it was." He didn't know where it was. And it's going to be started by a guy called Alan Crawford, who was an Australian music publisher. He'd worked for Southern Music, and then he'd gone in Australia, and then he'd become the boss of Southern Music in the UK. And he was mad keen. The reason he wanted to start was because he wanted his music played on radio. That's exactly why he wanted to do it. And he also believed in commercial radio, which didn't exist to any great degree anyway in Britain. So with all those in mind, he called upon people who had some experience, and I of course had the experience of at least a few years in Sydney radio.
So you were part of the original Atlanta unit. Let me just ask you one more question here, Bryan. We'll come back to you later. When was the first that you heard of Ronan O'Reilly and Radio Caroline?
When Ronan O'Reilly, it's a very long and involved story.
We thought it might
be.
Very
politically, we can't really talk. I don't think it'd take me too long to explain it. But Ronan O'Reilly, in the end, I heard about him probably in maybe January of 1964 or something, maybe December 63. And he came to an arrangement with Crawford where some of the people who were going to work on Radio Caroline did recordings in Dean Street, which is where Radio Atlanta was. It was in 47 Dean Street, right next door to a brothel. A brothel was one side, and then 45 or whatever it was.
Saves a lot of walking.
Yes, it did. It came in quite handy, really, especially at late nights when we used to
Contra
do
deals in those days?
Yeah.
Let's go, Bryan, we'll come back.
Yeah.
Alan, you were on the Fredericia just days after Caroline first appeared. Yes. And also when Atlanta turned up. You were aware that you'd beaten Atlanta to this race?
Yes, we were. Caroline was first, obviously, Easter 64. And then a few weeks later, the Atlanta turned up. And we had no idea that the merger was imminent, only that there were rumours going around about it. And it wasn't until the date was Friday, July the 3rd, that Chris Moore came out to the ship to tell us that the merger had taken place, and the Mi Amigo was to become Radio Caroline South, and we were going places elsewhere. We didn't know where.
And did you have a choice as to whether you went north or stayed south?
Yes, that was decided amongst us, and Tom Lodge, I and Jerry Layton stayed on the original ship and sailed off to we know not where at that time.
Caroline North we'll certainly come back to in a while. Let's go, I think, chronologically again to Skues on the news. Keith Skues and his programme as well. Keith, I guess you and perhaps Norman St John about the same time. I think Keith might have the edge on it.
I joined not used to speaking without a husband. There's an on switch and an off switch. I never knew that. That's what made... Do you know, I've been broadcasting for 50 bloody years and I forgot to turn the microphone on.
That's why you said that.
Anyway, Ray, talking about whatever you were, I get... You see, when you get to my age, you need to write down the ad-libs, you see. Was it?
You need to write down the questions.
Oh, that was it. Yes, you see, they even got that wrong. So the question, reading the question back was Norman St. John. Well, he came after me. I know that because we used to do those naughty tricks, what was called initiation ceremonies. But by the by, I went out with a disc jockey. He was an up-and-coming guy. I've got his name written down here somewhere. Tony Blackhead. Tony Blackburn. So I joined a similar time than Mr. Blackburn joined Caroline, which would be shortly after the merger with Atlanta and Caroline. So I was employed, in fact, by Alan Crawford's lot, and I didn't meet Ronan until shortly before I went out to Caroline. And I'd been in Forces Radio beforehand, Forces Broadcasting, stationed overseas, so I was in Aden, way out in the desert, and I hadn't the foggiest idea what Radio Caroline was or Radio Atlanta. And I came back and was offered this job with Radio Atlanta, and I presume we were broadcasting from Dean Street. And they said, Alan Crawford said, well, you know, you go to Harwich and you get this bird. I said, excuse me, what are you talking about? He said, we're broadcasting from a ship. I said, you're bloody mad. Why can't you? It's Dean Street. I know it's in the red light area, but come on. Why are we Then he explained all about, you know, international waters, etc. Norman came along shortly after, and Simon D was on at that particular time. Legend in his own breakfast time. Of course, the first voice, wasn't he, really? The first live voice on Radio Caroline. So he was on, and a chap called Doug Carr, K-E-R-R. And Norman came later, and what we had to go through in those days, they tested us. I don't know if it happened during Johnny's days, but with the new guys who, I didn't know anybody, they didn't know me, and they tested us out by doing stupid things. So when I arrived the first fortnight, they said, everybody else on the ship's got a cabin, you haven't, you've got to sleep in the paint store, which was at the front of the ship. Now, there is a technical name for it, it's not the stern, it's the other end. And I stayed in this awful paint store, which was for about a week. Anyway, I did survive, and that was that. The following shift, or the shift after that, along came a new boy. Of course, I'd won my spurs now, I was okay. Right, let's do an initiation test. We'll put him out onto lifeboat drill. So we went to the captain and said, Captain, sorry to trouble you, we want to do lifeboat drill tonight. And he said, oh, no, don't launch the lifeboats, for goodness sake. You know, we're going to have a lot of aggro. So Norman came out, and I'm very tired. I've come across from, was it Radio somewhere?
City.
Radio City or Australia, one of the three. I'm very tired, I want to go to bed. So off he went to bed. He'd been briefed by the captain what to do, what not to do. He'd been told all about lifeboat drill. So off he went to bed. And about 4 hours later, the engineer, who doesn't want his name mentioned, George Saunders, S-A-U-N-D-E-R-S, was given the task of knocking on the cabin door with Norman and saying, lifeboat drill, get on, you know, put your jacket on and everything, you're going to be up there on the top deck, manning the lifeboat. And then he saw me, and I said, well, just hold the wheel, hold it really, really hard. He was in his pyjamas, it was freezing cold, and it must have frozen his nudges off.
It did. Gone.
So you take up the rest of the story, Norman.
Yeah, well, the rest of the story is not real good. However, after 45 minutes, I realised that we were either going to die from the ship sinking or I'd die of the cold. So I decided to let go of this wheel that I was hanging on like very tight for, and I went downstairs, and there they all are in the mess, drinking Heineken beer and laughing. And so that was my initiation to Radio Caroline. I've got to tell you one thing. Keith Skues has been very popular in the radio business because he never could turn the microphone on.
Let's move on to an episode that those on board will never forget. Patrick Starling, certainly on board in January 1966. Norman, you were as well, and a visit to Frinton Beach. Patrick, your first thoughts when I mentioned that going aground in Holland?
I can remember the night that it actually happened because we used to watch Anglia television, and the boat was actually rocking. And the thing is, the TV just went off out of tune, and we had to dash up onto the top deck and actually turn the aerial around to point it back at the TV transmitter. And the thing is, then it just kept on going. Then we then realised that the boat was actually drifting, and the engineer Tony Fisher, ship's engineer that is, actually tried to start the engine of the boat, and the boat was badly fouled, and the thing is, it couldn't actually make its way back out to sea, and I think the captain did a brilliant job of actually breaching it on the beach between two groins, which if the boat had actually landed on the groins, would have broken the back of the boat.
Norman, you were on board then. You can tell us all these years later. Were you frightened?
I know which groin it hurt first. Actually, I was watching television on the BBC, and all of a sudden came up these lines underneath that said, "Radio Caroline, if you're watching this program, you are running aground." And I didn't believe it. And I looked outside the window. Now, if you can imagine, you're out in a force 9 gale, right out in the middle of the ocean, total darkness, and suddenly you look around and all these lights seem to be bobbing up and down right next to where you are. I went down and woke Tony Blackburn up. He was not too pleased, because he was doing the breakfast show and had to be up at 4:30. He thought it was an absolute joke. But when he realised that, in fact, we were just about to die, it was totally different. And it was. But it was a very scary night. Really scary.
The ship went off, came over to the Netherlands for repairs.
Yes.
The Cheetah 2 appeared, and this is where Robbie and Tony come into the story. Tony Prince, and tell us about your days as a fledgling Caroline jock when you ended up in the south before going to the north.
I was on a TV show before Caroline in Bristol, Discs a Go-Go. We couldn't hear Caroline in Bristol. It was outside of the signal reach. But I kept reading about this exciting pirate ship in the NME, the New Musical Express. And the name Tony Blackburn came up on a record. Now, I used to help the producer to choose the groups and musicians for the show. I said, would you book this guy? He's a pirate DJ. I'd really like to meet him. And he booked Blackburn down. His record was called Don't Get Off That Train. So Tony came down and he told me all the contacts. And when the TV show came to an end, I contacted Chris Moore. And I'd passed my audition up at Caroline House. He had me in his office and said, listen, Tony, have you got an agent? I'm just about to go out. I've got a job. I'm really, really excited. I said, yes, I do. I've got Phil and Dorothy Solomon. He said, just close that door a minute, will you? He said, no fucking way are you working on Radio Caroline if that's your agent. Those were his very words. I said, what's the problem? He said, problem, I don't like the guy. I have no time for him, and I have no time for anybody who's with his agency. I said, well, what do I do? He hasn't got me any work. You know, he said, well, come to our solicitors, we'll get you out your bloody contract. And that's what happened. They got me out my contract. I went down to Caroline, stayed there a few weeks. I think it was December 65, stayed a few weeks, and then they sent me up north where they couldn't understand me. I'd been on there a few weeks, and I came off on my leave and got a message, phone Tom Lodge, Caroline House. So I phoned Tom Lodge, put me 5p's, my 1 shillings into the coin box on the Edgerton Street telephone box. What's up, Tom? He said, you're not going back to the ship. I said, what? I said, I've got more bloody fan mail up here than Tony Blackburn was getting down on Caroline South. What are you talking about? He said, I'm afraid you're sacked. Phil Solomon has just become Ronan's partner.
Let's bring in. I'll come back again, Tony. I'm just trying to get everybody in.
Sure.
Let's go to Robbie if we can, because about this time that you joined in, and we'll get onto the Phil Solomon stories perhaps a little later, or as much as we've got time to tell, perhaps today. So, Robbie, your first involvement, because you were there at the time when there were 2 Caroline Souths, weren't you?
That's right. Yeah, the Cheetah was the replacement boat for the Mi Amigo. And it was a far more comfortable boat. I remember how comfortable it was. Big staircases, big studio, lots of dining areas and what have you. And I was lucky enough to meet Graham, who's not here, unfortunately. And Australia is a long way away, I guess, yeah?
It is, and they haven't moved it.
They were trying to move it with one of those Weissmuller tugboats, but the chain broke. However, so I got my first little bit of training there with Graham, and it was marvellous. Anyway, that was my experience of the Cheetah. And then, of course, I was given the job as being the most junior of telling everyone to go and listen to 259. As Caroline then was on 199, and I was given that job, and I was broadcasting that continually for about 4 or 5 hours.
That must be quite an unusual thing to claim, really, that your first DJ job was telling people to turn off and tune into another radio station. That's
Best shot you've ever done, Robbie.
Let's have a little bit of audio. 22, I think, might just serve the point here.
Ain't no man told me about Caroline. Well, you know, it's a boat, isn't it?
I bet this worked well compared to the Radio London jingles. What were you thinking? Keith, you might have been on board at the time when Radio London turned up with all these expensive Pam's jingles, and you'd got these, or perhaps Bryan might be the man here. Bryan.
I just knew, because I'd worked in Sydney, and I knew that they were Pam's jingles, and they're on 2UE in Sydney, so they were exactly the same jingles and we couldn't compete with that kind of professionalism that it gave to the station and the sound of the station.
Frustrating, Keith?
Yeah.
Very, yes.
Yeah.
But later I jumped ship and worked for Radio London just to play the jingles. Didn't play much music, but the jingles were great.
Let's move on to 66, Gord Cruse. You started down south and then went up to the north, didn't you, Gordon?
Yes, you're right, Ray. I started in, I think, early part of 1966 in London, working in a garden furniture warehouse. Young guy I was working with said, "What do you do in Canada?" I said, "I had 5 years in broadcasting." "Why don't you go and work for Radio Caroline?" I said, "What's Radio Caroline?" Because we call our station CJNB or CFQC or CKNW. So I investigated. Graham Webb hired me. I was reading a newscast he gave me. I got about 40 seconds into it. The studio door pops open, and I thought, I've blown it. He's going to tell me to get out real fast. He looked at me and he said, "Gordy, can you start on Monday?" Blew me away. At the time, I had no idea of the magnitude of this situation. And I'm really pleased to be here today, enjoying all the accents, enjoying the people. I've learned more about pirate radio in the last 3 days than I knew the whole year I worked for them. And I'm really pleased to be here.
Good, coming over from Canada. Nice guy. Thank you, Gordon. Let's stick with the news for a moment and go to John here as well. And John, you worked on just about every station going, but you certainly did both
7
Carolines.
of them, actually. Plus Pearl and Dean. I joined the North Ship on the 12th of July 1966 and was part of the news crew employed by good old Graham Webb, to which I owe him everything, I suppose. And it was great up there. I loved it. I got, however, I did get made redundant, which was an odd thing. What used to happen in Parliament, every once in a while, a minister would stand up and say, "We must get rid of these pirate people," to which the advertisers would panic and pull the plug on advertising or halve it. And so it went on. So I was made redundant. I left on the 27th of September 1966. only to have a letter arrive from them saying, can you join the South Ship in December 66, which I did. And the 28th of February actually was a landmark day for me, because the tender was coming out. We'd been up all the night before in a very, very severe gale, and I thought, this boat is going to sink. I've got to get off it. So I left it. But it didn't sink then. It went on and on and on for years. But the other thing, may I do one quick story, which could have been a disaster, but it wasn't. I'd taken a freshly baked roll and cup of coffee up to Daffy Don Allen, put that down in the studio. I came out, and for some obscure reason, I looked left across towards Liverpool, and there were two specks on the horizon, black, moving around a bit. And I kept an eye on that, and eventually got hold of our captain, Captain Martin Gibbs, and we sort of looked at him disgusted, and he said, hang on, I'll go and get some bits and pieces to view this. Came out with all the telescopes and God knows what, and he said, no, this is very interesting. He said, they're putting out a smoke screen, and if they hold their current course, they're on a collision course with us, which is not good news to hear. Anyway, eventually, cut a long story short, the two boats get to us, and they split formation. One is going clockwise, the other one is going anti-clockwise. There are lights flashing and everything, and all the Dutch guys are going, wish we'd remembered our Morse codes and everything. And suddenly, instead of trying to communicate by tapping bits of wood together and whatever they do, there was a sudden burst of noise. Radio Caroline, will you play the following records for us? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. John Aston. David, we'll go with David Williams while we're here as well and talk about the North Ship and news as well. I mean, you were on a luxurious ferry boat, weren't you, compared to the guys down south?
Oh, well, apparently, yeah, I did work very shortly on the South Ship for about 3 weeks. And then Graham moved me up to the North Ship, and that was luxury, as you say, in comparison. You sit there with your own cabin.
Nicer people.
Oh, yes.
Not
no,
true.
I mean,
I say. Not true. Bloody dare you.
And a huge audience. I mean, you'd got Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, Scotland, the whole of the Northwest, hadn't you?
I mean, we had a sort of, our audience was the whole of the north of England, basically, plus Ireland. I mean, we had 12 to 15 million all the time.
And Tony, when you came ashore, sorry, David, when you came ashore, what sort of response were you getting when you stepped ashore off that tender at the
Well, you know, you suddenly knew what it was like to be a pop star. It was that kind of level, you know, people used to come to meet you off the tender. They used to come in tourist boats around the ship and things like that, you know. And then we started doing gigs, you know, and they just, you filled a venue as quickly as the status quo could, you know. It was that kind of level. It was an amazing experience.
Let's come along to Wally, because you knew a bit of the pop star life with the show bands in Ireland, didn't you?
Yeah, I was with a show band for quite a few years, and I decided to change from playing music to records. And I was married for 1 week. We're on a honeymoon, and then I got the call, would I please go to the airport and collect some tickets to join Caroline. So I was very sad. It was a toss of a coin, actually.
Did you make the right decision?
Yeah, I definitely did.
Well, you wouldn't have had a trip to Holland if not. I mean, just how special was Caroline North? Let's concentrate on the North Ship. We'll get to the South guys in just a moment. But I mean, it was everything, because there was no other ship there apart from Radio Scotland, which at times was on the opposite coast.
That's true. There's nothing else. Even in Ireland, there was only the one radio station, and they kept playing the same kind of music all the time, you know. Very boring. And so Caroline was a great thing for the people, especially in Ireland, because we picked up very clear.
And you were getting good mail from Ireland as well. The Irish loved it as much as the Scots and the Welsh and the English.
Yeah.
Steve Young, he's a Canadian coming over to Britain. Had you heard about the Pirates before you turned up, or did you just happen to think, what's this on the radio?
Other way, there we are. Yeah, I'd certainly heard about the pirate radio stations, but never in a moment did I ever dream that I'd end up working on one. Kind of a coincidental thing, but I would like to say, Ray, that Keith Skues was kind of complaining about being in the paint locker in the front of that ship. I was glad to be in what I described as the chain locker on the Mi Amigo, because I was the all-night guy. Right? I was the guy you never saw during the day, because I slept during the day and I worked at night. But the tender would come alongside at 11 o'clock promptly most every day if the weather conditions permitted. And there was a lot of rattling of chains and a ho-de-ho and a hi-de-hi and here's your mail and giggles and gales of laughter from girls who didn't stay on board, but the giggles and gales of laughter were from the guys, actually. But I needed a place where I could have a good night's kip, and that front chain locker, despite the fact that there was the odd chain rocking against the side of the ship, was the place to be. But it was great for a kid coming from Medicine Hat, Alberta, little cow town on the prairies in Western Canada, another flatlander like this guy here. It was a quantum leap. It was like leaping from planet Earth to Mars, to be in this milieu of radio and music and pop stars and great guys that I worked with all that time. It was fantastic.
And what about the response, Steve? Because you were one of the first European overnight guys. Radio Essex might have just touched on it, Radio England perhaps, but you were one of the few to do that 2 till 6. What response were you getting?
Actually, it was midnight till 6. I did a 6-hour shift. The other guys, 3 hours, and I was the full guy. But actually, it was kind of interesting because the majority of my audience were from continental Europe, and I had a lot of American GIs who used to listen to my show. They loved black music, they loved Motown, R&B, soul, and so I tended to gravitate more towards that when I could deviate from the playlist, which eventually came in. That was kind of a sad day when they brought in the more strict playlist, because when I first started, they were still pretty freeform. You could play almost whatever you liked. But as we described, we're not going to talk about that now. But
we might just touch on it.
Might touch on it later. Thanks, Ray.
The playlist ended when I ripped it in half and chucked it out the porthole. Actually, that was the end of that.
Johnny, I'm back in a moment. Let's just go to Pat while we're here. Mark Sloane. And again, Mark, you did both ships, but let's concentrate on the South ship just to start with. And I know from chatting to you in the past, some of the manic things you got up to, Micah Hearn Slippers is one, but you told a lovely story about Tom Lodge and the exercises on the flat roof. So whilst everybody was sleeping...
Well, that was great. I joined the ship in '66. I came from Radio 390, and there were some fantastic guys on there. Keith Skues was there. There was Tony Blackburn. There was Tommy Vance came in later on, and then of course later on Johnnie came. We had Steve. We had Keith Hampshire. We had Rick Dane. Loads of really great people, and of course Emperor Roscoe with Alfie. Now Tom Lodge did have us doing exercises on the roof of the boat, and that's where I got my nickname. The Big Toe, because DLT was on the mic on the radio at the time. The microphone was open, and I stuck my big foot right in beside his head and the microphone, and so he said, "The Big Toe's on the air." So I got that nickname. While on the subject, a lot of us are pretty sad about what's going on with DLT, and we are really behind him, but that's another matter altogether. So I was on Caroline South reading the news. Now that had a hazard. Do you think there was an initiation ceremony elsewhere? The teleprinter roll was used, so you typed the news, having stolen it and reworded it. Swiss Radio was very good. It had some interesting news, and so you type it out. It was all on the roll of paper, rolled it up, and all you did was you sat in front of the microphone and you just pulled it down slowly. Here's the news, etc. And one day I'm doing this, and suddenly I can smell smoke, and I see some bastards climbed in underneath and set fire to the end of the news script, and I've still got 5 minutes news to read, and it's burning. But that was Caroline South. It was wonderful.
So here's the thing. Johnnie Walker turns up. He's the new kid in town from springing Radio England, and he's here at this station he's always wanted to go to. So did he ever stick to the rules? Did you ever use the playlist? Did you bed yourself in and then thought, right, let's attack?
Well, I used to either play the awful records that they pay to play, either at the beginning of the hour or at the end. And there was one when
a famous rock and roll manager guy, whose name escapes me for the minute, but Roger will prompt me. Sharon's dad.
Don Arden.
Thank you very much, Don Arden. He made a record called Sunrise, Sunset, and it was the biggest load of dirge you've ever heard in your life. So I put it off and put it off, and finally about 5 to 11, the end of the hours that it was supposed to go out, I put it on, and I said, God, I said, you wouldn't want this played at your funeral, this is bad. You know, so then I stuck it on, I said, let's speed it up a bit, because it was very slow. Sunrise, sunset. So I stick it on 78. Sunrise, sunset, that was a bit of an improvement. And then we tried it at 33, and basically I trashed it. Unbeknown to me, Don Arden was having a party at his house, called all his friends round, was giving them all champagne, said, my record's going to be on the radio. And about 10:30, they're saying, Don, we haven't heard your record yet. He said, it'll be on soon. And then finally it gets played, in not quite the way that he intended. So then he got on to Phil Solomon and said, get that Johnnie Walker off the ship. And they rung every guy with a boat on the coast could go out and get me off the ship. But fortunately, they're all in the pub and too pissed to worry about going out. So.
And Robbie, you're the guy that had to water this down. You had to act as the go-between between land and stuff on the ship.
Yes, well, that was about the 15th time that Johnnie had been fired. I mean, Phil would fire Johnnie every time I went ashore. Every time I spoke with him, he'd say, that Johnnie Walker, get him off the ship. And the problem was, of course, that he just insisted on playing his own music. And Phil was collecting dosh for pays for plays. And I had a terrible dilemma, because at the end of the day, the food, the fuel oil, and all that sort of stuff was all being paid for from payola. And so the records had to be played, otherwise there was no income. And as it was, we kind of ran out the Weissmullers, towed the ships. The following year, very early on, I think it was about April or so, well, they towed them because they hadn't been paid.
Let's go back to that again in just a moment, Johnny.
I just want to say, you make that point that playing these dreadful records was enabling the station to stay on the air, yet the Weissmuller brothers never got any money, so where did it go?
Yeah, well, you know, we had a reasonable quality of life on board, Johnny. We differ on this one, by the way, because he used to tear up the playlist and I used to stick it back together again with sellotape.
Coming up to August the 14th, and you had to face facts. Do we go ashore and say the party's over, or do we stay here? Where were you two guys together? Three. I mean, Roger was there as well prior to August the 14th. Were you in the same place at the same time when you decided you were going to go ahead with this? Was it Ronan that talked you into it, or asked you if you wanted to stay? Was it Solomon? Where were you when you made that decision? Robbie, start with you.
But both of them. I'd spoken to Ronan and I'd spoken to Solomon. Solomon said, well, the money will be there as long as we've got a team to stick together. And I recall having spoken with all the jocks and the newsreaders a couple of weeks earlier, and we had the support. And then to arrive back to the ship, as we did on that fateful day, with, we mustn't forget him, Spangles Muldoon, Chris Carey, and Johnnie and myself, and that was it. That was the rest of them were going to retire early.
And Ross here is news guy as well, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
on
okay.
That,
there he is. Yeah, actually, we never got Spangles Muldoon or Chris Carey until about 11:30 p.m. that night. So the tender was out there at lunchtime, and they all walked off, the guys who were going to stay. And I understand their problem. Robbie and I were on shore. We had the most amazing scenes of support. The Baltabrin ballroom we went to, bedecked in flowers, Procol Harum were playing. Queue about half a mile long outside. So enormous support Robbie and I had. But the people out on the ship were just sitting there worrying about what might happen if they decided to carry on broadcasting. So they all left. So there was Ross. We figured he was like half a DJ because he'd never really done a program. So it was Robbie and I, 2.5 DJs, to try and keep going a radio station. Now I remember we had a meeting. We said, what are we going to do? And Robbie said, well, you go on, you do 2 to 6, I'll come on and do my show. And then I remember about 3:05, Robbie comes in, tears in his eyes, and said, I've just heard Radio London closed down, and Big Lil played for the last time. And I remember Robbie just said these words, and he was very emotional about it. And he just said, we are now on our own. And at that point, I started to think, wow, this is quite a big thing we've got ourselves into here.
Yeah. Ross, when you went out there, I mean, how was it sold to you? Just get out there as quickly as you can because we need you?
Oh, definitely. I was doing mostly the news service, which was very inventive system that we downloaded the news from the BBC and ITV and then rewrote it so it sounded more like our news, and now and again we'd have news flash from Port and Story. But I'd been working on 390 when I went over to Radio Caroline, and I was happy to stay with them, but they asked for volunteers to go to the North Ship, so I decided to go to the North Ship.
And there you would have gone on as Freddie Beare.
I did, yes. Yeah, frantic Freddie Beare.
Yeah, yeah. And how were things that you was tendered from Dundalk there, were you?
Yes, it was still a Dutch tender, but they went out from Dundalk, but it took anything from 6 to 12 hours to get out to the Caroline North, depending on which way the weather was going, depended on whether the tender boat went round the top of the Isle of Man or came round the bottom, and it could be a pretty rough trip sometimes.
In a moment we'll get to the South guys and Roger and Bud as well, and Johnnie, and ask about what the topic of conversation in the mess room was, but further into 1967 towards 1968, could you see the writing on the wall?
No, not at all. We were happy broadcasting. The Isle of Man government supported the station being there.
After August, after September, in the case of
after
North.
September, yeah. And in fact, they didn't recognise the implication of the offences bill that was brought in, and it wasn't until the British government decided that they would restrict tourist travel to the Isle of Man that the Manx government decided they had better fall in line, and that's when we decided we would keep broadcasting.
Let's briefly go to Tony while we're here. Tony, you made that decision to come off. Was it a hard decision?
No, it was quite easy, really. I asked the listeners what I should do, and I said I will stick to the mail, the letters I receive. If you say stay, I'll stay. And there's a huge majority, like 90%, said get off and go and sort yourself out on shore. But that wasn't really the crucial part of the decision. The decision was made by Phil Solomon, because he basically made the station sound terrible with those awful records on Major Minor and Emerald Records, and they killed the spirit of the DJ. And I guess if it had been a free playlist like it hadn't been in the early days, our passions would have still been boiling. We would have still enjoyed the job, but we were not enjoying it as much because of Phil Solomon's arrival on the scene.
Just listen to the tape, though. Roger down in the south was enjoying it because he was still passionate, as he is now. Roger, you'd gone off. You were off the ship over that 14th of August, weren't you? Passport?
Yeah. I was a late joiner because Johnnie and I were on Radio England, started out together, as a lot of people know, and this bugger got the bloody job foot before me, the sod. He was straight off the bloody ship, right round to Caroline House, so fair enough, but I was doing discos and that, and Terry Bates, the man who invented Cash Casino, which saved Caroline's bacon, I got a phone call from him. My dad said, there's a fellow called Terry Bate called for you. I said, yeah, fine, fair enough, and he said, I meant to see him, and I said, look, we're going illegal. Does it bother you? I said, no, I don't believe in the law. I'll do it. But the trouble is, my passport ran out, and I didn't mind going illegal, but I didn't want to go without a passport. I didn't, because I needed one. And so unfortunately, I left these guys in the lurch. There's no other way to describe it. I had to go off to get the passport. Got the passport, and dear old Jimmy Houlihan, Ronan's right-hand man, got me out on my first ever plane flight, and the lovely trip from Holland, which I got many times, to the ship. So that was it. But I was bloody glad to be back. And I mean, Terry said to me, does it worry you about, going to jail for the cause? I said, no, stuff this bloody government. It's outrageous that they should pass this bill. I don't believe in it. I'm going to fight with it. But I really wish I'd been on there on the hour, and I really felt I'd let them down.
And it wasn't long before other brave men gave up the whatever that was that Johnnie said. Ballou came along, same day as Andy Archer as well. So, again, not so much a worry for you, Bud, because presumably with a foreign passport, but at the same time, you didn't want to be in the thick of it if things got nasty, I guess.
Yeah, I joined Caroline mainly for adventure, to be honest with you. I already had a career starting in the States for a couple of years, and I'd been over in '66 and heard the Pirates in all their glory, Radio England, Radio London, Caroline, and came back in '67 not knowing that the Marine Offences Act had even been passed. And I was very surprised when I got there that they were all gone, except for Caroline. And I saw a London Times, I think it was, on the tube, and at the bottom of the front page, it was a headline that said, "Pirate on verge of profitability." and it talked about, I had a picture of Ronan, and anyway, I called the newspaper, and the reporter gave me Ronan's address, his office on Dean Street. And I went down there, and that's where I ran into Andy Archer, and we were hired the same day and sent out.
Johnny, Robbie, go on, Roger.
Andy only joined because he misread what the Marine Offences Act was.
Is this one of those jokes where you guess the next line? Because I think all of us are one step ahead of you.
He'd admit it himself.
The thing was, after that midnight announcement that we were going to keep going, and we had a couple of journalists in the cabin and the last legal boat, and they were taking photographs and stuff, and Robbie and I were singing "We Shall Overcome." We played "All You Need Is Love." Go to bed, and then in the morning I wake up, I thought, it's bound to be the Royal Navy, we're going to be surrounded. We'll be taken off and clapped in irons, and woke up, went out on deck, not a bloody sod there. It was absolutely calm. And then I heard this little voice shouting, "Hello, hello," and we look over the side, and there's this tiny inflatable some guy had got in Clacton. He was on a fishing holiday, and he chugged out with this tiny, and he goes, "Do you want anything from the shops?" So we kept going, and then I always wish I'd been a better songwriter, because one day we thought, well, we're laughing now, we're still here, they can't put us off the air, let's go 3 miles in and sing a song to Harold. So we stuck a couple of boxes of Heineken in the lifeboat, lowered the lifeboat, started it up, chugged in, and I said, well, I reckon we're inside the 3 mile limit now. So we just popped a couple of beers, all stood up and go, "Fuck you, Harold, oh Harold, fuck you." And then I thought we better chug back to the ship now. So as I head back to the Caroline ship, and coming out, zooming out, is this bloody great speedboat with about 15 very heavy-duty looking guys on. And fortunately, we just got back to the boat in time. They circled around a couple of times and then went off. So it was a bit of a narrow escape, that one. But Brilliant. It was a lot of fun.
Robbie, we get to the bleak winter, December into 1968, January, February. Johnny had made reference on air, professional guy that he is, but he was a bit peed off on occasions, and you could understand it from what we've been hearing. Were you getting alarm bells ringing at that time? Were you thinking that this is it, we're going to break up, or did you think it could succeed?
Well, no, I didn't. I've got to be honest about this. I did not think for one moment that it was going to go. I was aware, very much aware, because I had this go-between between Ronan and go-between. I was the man that spoke to Solomon, and I took all the abuse that he would lash out, and take it on board as part of my responsibility. I would talk him into rehiring whoever he just fired, and he would sometimes fire 2 or 3 people. He fired Chris Carey once or twice. But that was all part and parcel of the job. And so I didn't think for one moment that he was not paying the Weissmullers, although I was aware that they were crying out for money, because I was in touch with the Weissmullers also. And I used to arrange meetings between, say, Ronan and Phil and myself and the Weissmullers. And sure enough, either Ronan or Phil didn't turn up. And they were playing this bit of a game, so it was rather difficult then to justify to the Weissmullers that they were lashing out money every week on sending out fuel oil, food, and all the rest of it, and tendering services, when they weren't actually getting any pay for it.
Okay, here's the big question. All 3 of you in the centre there might want to answer it. Bud as well. Leave aside personalities. Who was the smarter guy, Phil Solomon or Ronan Riley?
Ronan.
For the ideal or the money? I mean, it depends on how you look at it, I guess.
No, we've got to. Ronan was the idealist.
Now, Ronan was 8 miles high.
Ronan had talent.
Yeah.
Ronan had talent and had vision. Solomon had money. And what is often forgotten is how early Solomon came in to the whole operation of Planet Productions. he came in, he paid for the refit of the Mi Amigo and the new transmitters. That was all down to Phil Solomon. And so I was aware of this, and he reminded me of it frequently. And he reminded me also of the fact that he was a businessman and Ronan was, I think he used to refer to him as a spendthrift. He was a bit of a wild fellow. So, although Ronan had given me my job, I felt torn between the two and the jocks.
3rd of March, sorry guys, we're having to compress this, we could be here all day and still would be fascinated. 3rd of March, the ships came in, it was over. Could Caroline have continued, Johnny, had those ships not been towed in?
The worst thing about it is we didn't know that it was over. And I'd been on the air till midnight doing my show, and then I came off, and as I often did, bowl of cornflakes, get some toast going, cup of tea, chat to the Dutch crew till about 3 in the morning, go to bed, and then somebody's shaking me and waking me up at 5 a.m. saying, get up quick, there's a load of Dutch sailors on board. So I go upstairs, and there were a load of heavyweight Dutch guys who had boarded the ship and said, you've got 10 minutes to get your stuff out of the studio, and then we seal it. And we realised that we're going to tow us to Amsterdam. So we were thinking, well, maybe we're going to Amsterdam to have a bit of a refit, scrape the hull, that sort of thing. And the moment they actually cut the anchor chain, that's when I pretty much knew I think it was all over. Because had the ship going to be coming back, they'd have put the chain on a buoy so we could come back and connect up. So it was a very sad time, and all I could think about as we towed across the North Sea was all those people waking up and turning on their radio. And the silence, and being scared to touch the tuning dial, but just to wait and see if Caroline's coming back on. Maybe we've gone off air for a generator fault, and we never came back. So it was a very sad way for it to end after the brave stance of everybody who took part after August 14.
But let's just go, Roger, perhaps, as one of the jocks there and an integral part of the team, had the ships not been towed in a year, 2 years, 3 years, what would have happened to Caroline?
I kind of think I'd have still been there. I was actually up when they came alongside, and the Dutch crew that worked on the tug also they used to work on Caroline because they used to do rotors, and they came on board and there's the banter between the Dutch and the English, you know, what are you silly sods doing here? We've come to tow you to Japan. And I said, yeah, very funny. Went to do my shave, get ready for the show, and then as Johnny said, they said you got 5 minutes to get out of the studio, and that was it. To this day, I wish I'd flung up on the microphone and said, get somebody out here, we're in big trouble. But hindsight, hindsight. But no, it could have continued, and I kind of wonder, would I still be there doing it? And I would. Can we just have a round of applause for Ronan, please? Because I think that'd be kind of nice. Because he's the man. I don't care about brains or... Because if it hadn't been for him, none of us would have been here. And he's not very well at the moment, so thank you very much to him. He is my hero and always will be. I'd do anything for him. Ooh.
I'll tell you what, and Roger makes a good point. It was on my note here, but I think whilst we're here, we should all remember, I was just trying to scribble down a few names of some very well-known guys and not so well-known that sadly are no longer here, and the chances are many of them would have been, I'm hoping, I'm assuming. Mick Loves It, Micah Hearn, Tom Lodge, Simon D, John Junkin, Ken Evans, Percy Scadden, Don Murison. I know Alan told me that in the very early days, if it hadn't been for him more or less standing bail, it might not have happened. Tommy Vance, Alan Crawford, Don Allen, Carl Mitchell. I'm sure there are more, and I'm sure you guys have worked with them as well. Did I mention Tom Lodge? Yeah, I think Tom is on the list here.
Surf.
Yeah, yeah. Chris Moore, I think, is round. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you could just keep going, but I think representing the elders of an amazing organisation, although there are those that would argue that Caroline and organisation are two words that never go together. But let's just show our appreciation for these guys, because without these guys, we wouldn't be here today.
Can I just have one word? Thank you. Thank you.
Tony.
I'd just like to say, this is Cutmaster Swift on the camera over here. He's a world DJ champion at DMC. He's worked for us for a long time. He's now our cameraman and editor. And we're doing a documentary called The History of DJ, and I hope we'll be representing the adventures we've been talking about in that documentary, which will be on our website. But I just want to say one thing. The question we're asking with that camera here today is radio dead? Never mind Caroline, never mind Radio London. Is radio dead? Or could it be that this is the time for personality DJs to come back and save radio?
I think we're just going quickly to Pat here as well, Pat Hamilton, Mark Sloane, who's got a bit of the past that I think everybody's aware of and could be coming to the current right now. Over to you, Pat.
Right. I know some of you are collectors of memorabilia. I found something in the wardrobe that was last worn in September 1967. I haven't worn it since. It looks pretty faded, but it is still in perfect order. I thought that those of you who are interested in memorabilia, there it is, the original T-shirt. There's a photograph of me wearing it at Oncan Stadium in the Isle of Man when I was on Radio Caroline North after we became illegal. I'd like to think somebody might want to raise some money for in memory of Rob Orloff and for the Sticky Media Comunicatie, or the Foundation for Media Communication. So, anybody interested? How are we going to do this? Speak to Hans Knott about it. Make a bid for it.
That might be the easiest way to do it. I guess. Talk
to Hans if you're interested.
Okay.
Thank you.
Guys, thank you once again. I've never interviewed 19 people in one hit. That's Jesus. I think Wally's going to go on to our next part on the agenda. There's still plenty more to come. Don't forget to pay for your food as well. Otherwise, it'll end early. But I'll pay for mine, so my dinner's there. Wally's going to sing for his now, I think. Wally Meehan here on a very special day. Very special day. Another round of applause for these guys, and another round of applause for Wally as he takes the microphone.